What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Yours Truly podcast. I'm your host, Christian Baxter, and today I am joined again by someone who's become an important voice in my own thinking journey, Brendan Graham Dempsey. If you're new to his work, Brendan explores what comes after modernity and postmodernity, what he and others call metamodernism. He writes, researches, and teaches in that space how culture moves, how spirituality mutates, and how individuals reconstruct meaning after the old frameworks crack. He's the author of Metamodernism, The Return of Transcendence, God, a blank verse epic, The Combat Myth According to Mark, and runs the Sky Meadow Institute in Vermont, where he experiments with metamodern forms of contemplative community. Brendan and I talked almost a year ago, and those conversations became foundational for me in this space. We touched everything from biblical scholarship and historical criticism to personal mystical experience, nihilism, deconstruction, and what it means to try to rebuild faith that can survive contact with reality. Those episodes pushed me to articulate much more clearly what I mean by symbolic theology, sacramental ontology, and my own ongoing reconstruction of Christian practice. A lot's changed since then for both of us. Brendan has continued exploring the metamodern religious, cultural, and paradigmatic landscapes. I've been helping build a liturgical and sacramental community here in Arkansas while digging deeper into this digital corner of the internet, participating in this scene's further evolutions. So today isn't part 3 of an old conversation. It is a new one. I want to ask Brendan about where Metamodernism is now that the culture dust has shifted once again. Thank AI and new political changes, about what he's learned from the wave of conversations he's had across this corner and other liminal scenes, about where culture is actually metamorphosizing to, where it's still defending old containers, and of course, about the deeper question beneath all of this. How do people rebuild meaning in a time when every meaning structure is contested? So with that, welcome back to the Yours Truly virtual studio for some conversation craft, Brendan Graham Dempsey, the Metamodernist. Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud. And we're rolling. So Brendan's back with me in the Yours Truly virtual studio to talk about all things metamodern, but maybe specifically metamodern Christianity, as we were kind of talking a little bit backstage. But kind of before we jump in, just what have you been up to? This last year, a year ago or so, there was kind of this nice, juicy Jordan Hall becomes a Christian, and you're talking to him, and you go and talk to Paul Vanderklay, and then a bunch of us swarm and talk to Brendan, and you were like, you had your arm broke or something, so you were you were just like, hey, I'll just talk to people for like 4 weeks or something. And and a lot's changed in probably year and a half. So what have you been up to last year?
Well, first, thanks for having me back. I appreciate it. I've always appreciated the stuff you're putting out into the space and your engagement and just your overall sensibility. You're super welcoming and kind human, and I appreciate that. And I really appreciated the kind of, blazing through the little corner space and people, kind of willing to have some conversations with me. I did at the time, have a broken hand, all better now. Thanks to, modern science and other lovely things. So maybe I'll just say more about that later on. But in terms of what I have been up to, it's been also very, very busy. I mean, it's so interesting, right? I mean, the landscape has really changed so much since that time. So much has happened. I think those early kind of signs of this kind of Christian revival were starting, to just be percolating when a lot of this was happening. And some of those major kind of popular or more what's the word I'm looking for? Popular figures converting, was sort of like just beginning, and now that whole inertia is still kind of continuing. So so much has changed sort of in the collective landscape. Personally, what's changed has also been very significant. I've got a new job now. I'm full-time at the Institute of Applied Meta Theory. And I basically study meaning. I study meaning making, and I study worldviews. And I've got a couple of major research programs that I'm heading up into those queries. And so that's been awesome to be able to go full time into those topics, which I'm really, really passionate about. So that's been really big. I think another thing that's happened is I put out volume 2 of my Evolution of Meaning series. What else? I've just been continuing to kind of hammer home at those kind of key topics, meaning and meaning making and spirituality and religion. Something that just announced actually recently is I'll be doing a course on John Vervaeke's Lectern, channel on meaning over time, matters over time, and all this stuff. So just kind of continuing to, explore that whole space and trying to make a meaningful contribution to our understanding of meaning and meaning making. Beyond that, there's a rich, full harvest at Sky Meadow. We've had a couple of Metamodern spirituality labs here, and sort of the general Metamodern movement has sort of been continuing to sort of go its various ways and whatnot. So anyway, I'll pause there, but that's some of the updates on my end.
Well, that sounds exciting. Congratulations on the new work. That's, as if you can kind of, vocationally connect like your passion to your vocation is always just it's interesting. It can kind of sometimes kill a little bit of it in the work aspect of it, but it's like, well, what else would you kind of be doing?
Yeah.
So I'm happy for you related
Thank
to
you.
that.
Thank you.
And of course, like, I guess, so just to tease out one little thing. So like Sky Meadow and this new job that you have, like, is Sky Meadow kind of move into like passion project stuff or kind of part-time work, or like, how does that?
Well, yeah, I mean, so Sky Meadow, there's a retreat center here, so that it continues unchanged, and anyone who wants to come do a retreat here can basically go through our website and kind of sign up and just do kind of use it for that. Sky Meadow Institute was something I started to do more of the kind of work I'm now doing at the Institute of Applied Meta Theory, and so some of the institute work has quieted specifically as I've kind of found this new avenue to be doing a lot of that, but it's still chugging along. We've got Sky Meadow Press. Layman Pascal will have a new book coming out on Nietzsche soon, and a couple of projects in the pipeline for that. And we keep doing the Metamodern Spirituality Lab. So yeah, Sky Meadow Institute still kind of chugging along, but the Institute of Applied Meta Theory has really allowed me to do the research stuff at like a new register. So yeah.
We're talking backstage about trying to get into like a metamodern Christianity conversation, but I'm so curious because like this, these kind of parallels and these kind of tracks, something like the journey of watching like Jonathan Peugeot's work turn in, Symbolic World Press and like these kind of like, narrowing into trying to get ideas refined, push them out into the culture in a more, some kind of packaged, clear way. Just that pattern is interesting to see you kind of walking through that. And so, I mean, I don't know. I just think that there's something to that pattern and related to meaning. I think like, your work, how do you take like work that you care about and you give it to the world? I don't know.
I mean, I think that's a kind of natural progression is, things start out and you kind of have a sense or a semblance of like what it's all about. But then hopefully, especially if there's some kind of uptake in the broader culture, you get opportunities to start to hone that and then like really distill it and then hopefully offer it in a way that's compelling and kind of in a way that people can really metabolize it, and that you yourself have metabolized it sufficiently so that you can offer it with clarity and some precision. So I think that just kind of as a natural consequence, comes along spending time with a certain set of ideas and really continuing to kind of chip away at them and try to work through the presentation to try to bring people on board and get that out there.
Yeah. And I think as we work our way towards metamodern Christianity, like this relational, these liminal relational space, digital liminal relational spaces. I remember when we talked, a year and a half or so ago, and and you mentioned like that little scene, this little corner of the internet bubbling up, and you had some conversation like Paul Antleitner and talking about metamodernism in the general culture, even though he's kind of does like a kind of Christian perspective, and you say you're working with John Vervaeke. Earlier this year, you and I took part in some stuff with Cadell Last Philosophy Portal.
Yeah,
kind of talking about these things, and that's kind of I just was listening through in preparation for this your recent conversation with Rufus Pollock, and y'all were kind of having that what we in this corner kind of sometimes talk about navel gazing, like what is this? That kind of conversation was at least the first part. And so how is that? I'm curious, like how are you seeing that continue to manifest in these kind of digital spaces, relationships, and such?
Yeah, I mean, similar to what we were just talking about of like refinement, clarification of ideas, and kind of upping the level of presentation. I think that happens at kind of the collective level too. So, in the initial phases, people kind of find each other, and then they're starting to still just kind of learn the space and the vocabulary and who's who and who's doing what. And then enough time goes by and there starts to be kind of a self-awareness of, oh, this is a thing, and like you can start to trace out the membrane and the boundaries of it, right? So like this little corner of the TLC, like it's got its membrane, right? And I think there are versions of that have been popping up all over the internet, really, and so at a certain point, it becomes very logical to like attend to that, to take the group as object and think about it. And that can become very navel gazily if it just stays at that level. But I think there's also something productive that can come with that, which is, okay, once you get a sense of that self-awareness, kind of reflexive self-awareness of, oh, this is a thing, then you can start thinking about, well, how do we do the next thing? How do we channel this? How do we direct this momentum, right? A lot of these different movements that have sprung up online in various ways that relate to, let's just say, the liminal web, really care about transforming the world for the better. So it's not just a matter of having friends on the internet you can talk to. It's about how do we, impact the way that systemically things are kind of organized and try to do what we can to enhance human flourishing. So I think that for that scale of kind of action, you do need a lot of people involved. And so once you're aware that, hey, I'm part of a collective group that has a similar worldview or mindset around these issues, how can we then marshal that and direct that and help people, be more effective at trying to achieve the changes that they're trying to make in society through that lens? So that's actually been an important thing that, for example, even the Institute of Applied Meta Theory, where I work, where we're doing with that, with, a broader sort of integrative community of folks, right? And a lot of those folks are in the liminal web. Some of them aren't. Some of them are, academics. Some of them are, sort of organizational leaders or institutional leaders who maybe don't have a full scope or sense of the vocabulary of some of these ideas yet. So a lot of the question then turns from not just how do we marshal this energy in this movement, it's also like, how can we expand these efforts to try to achieve, really meaningful social change in the world, and in the context of the meaning crisis, in the context of the meta crisis, right? There's particular interventions that seem really important, and so trying to just make the biggest impact possible.
So this is kind of using a lot of general terms of size and scope and culture and in these kind of general good and human flourishing, that kind of thing. And so but I guess coming to this conversation thinking about how does metamodernism either relate to something like lowercase Orthodox Christianity or metamodern Christianity? What is that a thing? And I was wondering, like, I wondered, kind of again referencing back kind of this season a year or so ago. I don't know if Paul Vanderklay started saying something like is this like a metamodern Christianity? And you're like kind of working and crafting with this word very, connected to the work, like, and you're into, this job now with theory of applied metamodernism. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but then Paul uses this word like metagelical, and he also has this framework related to evangelicalism in Christianity writ large is something like more like a marketplace within Christianity than actually being, there is a technical evangelical like framework, but evangelicalism has seemed more like entering into that marketplace. And I guess that's kind of related to even what I see take place within kind of these, I was listening again to the piece of that conversation you had with Rufus Pollock talking about being, Wilbur pilled, or like, in this corner, something like being Peterson pilled, and that kind of like, you have these like iconic and these ideas, and it's kind of like these paradigmatic shifts in people's consciousness, and then how these things then land into these different spaces. And it seems like some of them land into maybe, like you're moving more into like institutional spaces, and your work has been in some ways, I think from my perspective, like kind of aimed at kind of institutional like methodologies and research, like talking about, and then, this scrappy, blue collar kind of corner of the internet, but harnessing the digital and in a way being subversive into that. And then I was referencing Peugeot earlier. He's kind of getting into, I'm seeing what Symbolic World Press is doing, like harnessing they're getting into the evangelical marketplace with a lot of like the publishing that he's trying to do, because that's where, what kind of relationship do you have these things? And that's even kind of a liminal thing, because you have orthodoxy, and so that's kind of what I see a little bit. And then I see other young people that are, interested in institutional revival, to use that word we used earlier, but like Redeemed Zoomer, if you've seen any of his work on what, the Reconquista of mainline Protestants, it's kind of this similar, like, well, he wants to see an institution, like, reconnect to more Orthodox roots and all these kinds of things. But it's like, these things just seem to be in the water. And so maybe that's a framework, or at least kind of what I'm bringing in, thinking about metamodern Christianity a little bit. There's pieces there.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, I think what you're putting your finger on is that there's a lot of different ways that this is manifesting. And by this, something like what's in the water, this kind of cultural zeitgeist that's found expression in a meaningful way on the internet, and now is maybe starting to gain a degree of not quite institutional maturity, but some kind of maturity enough that it's starting to manifest in more institutional ways and trying to have certain kinds of impact. And that you see a kind of natural flowering and diffusion and differentiation there. But, I think, it's complex and it's multifaceted, right? So like, I think that there is something of there's a broad cultural transformation that's going on, and it has a lot of different facets to it. And wherever you want to put your finger on that elephant, there's going to be some different, kind of flavor that's going to take on. I'm mixing a million metaphors. I don't know why you put your finger on an elephant. It's got a flavor.
Well, that's the blind man. Isn't that the blind man kind of?
Yeah, that was the metaphor I was groping for there. But so I think the point is it's I guess I could also say it's like a hydra and it's got a lot of heads. But the point is there's a deep undercurrent of a certain kind of cultural change that's going on right now. And but it has a lot of different facets to it, not only in terms of the ideas that are kind of floating around in all of this, but also in terms of the kind of registers people are operating in, the kind of social context, the kinds of media that they're using. And but to the degree that this is a broad social phenomenon, you're going to have, online communities kind of emphasizing that kind of interpersonal and kind of group aspect. You're going to have people trying to make inroads into institutions and trying to change and adopt new methodologies. You're going to have et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's multifaceted. And, I think one of the things that's interesting about our conversations and kind of my nexus with or interface with the TLC is like there's enough of like a Venn diagram overlap there, but also very meaningful distinctions and differences as well. So there's like different languages and different contexts that we're speaking across, but I think there is also somehow in an interesting way a shared context for a lot of this, as disparate kind of as it all is. So yeah, I don't know, those are some thoughts.
something like the digital substrate of it. In a sense, it's like there's this sense of, oh, regardless of like kind of where you got pilled, but it's like we were all watching stuff on YouTube a decade ago, and
Sure,
it's
yeah.
like I if we're honest, likely that and then there's these ideas they're disseminating, and at different places where say 10, 5 to 10 years ago, people are at different places in their careers, and those ideas then 5-10 years later, they are being put back into institutional spaces or kind of religious spaces and things like that, and having on the ground impact, which is, I think, is one of the most curious parts of this. And what I guess in whatever season I'm trying to have these conversations with is at that juncture of this, Peugeot has said things in the past, like, the low guy, which is like, from the logos, like these things went out like into the culture, and now they're like growing up, and it's fascinating to kind of see. And, like the metamodern work, I think being something like that, going out from these, like we're saying, you have these, mimetic feudal lords. As I was having this conversation with a guy the other day, but, like Wilbur and these other things, like, and so I do think that's interesting. So, to kind of bring the conversation to that question or that topic related to metamodern Christianity, you have like a playlist where you went through and kind of outlined perspective on that. You have and I'll put links to our previous conversations, and you've told your story like very much like evangelical kind of charismatic upbringing in the 90s and whatnot. And then, your story goes into just like religious deconstruction related to, online apologetics and those types of things. And then like something, and then having, going into the depths of, I don't know what I don't want to put words that aren't true related to that, but something very nihilistic or despair related, and then being able to find meaning. And so obviously that story, that rhythm, that pattern, that part of humanity related to our previous paradigm, we come into something on the other side of that. And that's where it feels like the metamorphosis, beyond through all those things. And so what are you thinking about related to modern Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great topic to return to, because it's interesting to see how a lot of the space has unfolded over the past year and a half or so, whenever it was, since I was having a lot of conversations with people in this little corner. Yeah, I mean, I guess what would I say? I feel like there's maybe one observation would be, I see a sort of broad cultural trend, and I don't think that what I call metamodern Christianity is representative of that trend. I think that there's been a resurgence of interest in traditional and Orthodox, capital O and I guess lowercase o forms of Christianity, and that's very apparent, right? And you have very kind of there's a term I keep going for it. It's not popular. It's but people popular figures that everyone knows. High profile is, I think, the term I'm looking for. There've been these number of high profile kind of religious conversions, and this is like a trend, and a lot of people are moving in that direction. And so that, I think, is there's a strong trajectory right now visible in culture, making a certain kind of move. And I do think it's in response to where we've been. It's a response to the postmodern condition. It's a response to, the frustration with a sense of alienation and nihilism brought about by sort of postmodernism. I think in some ways it was, if not catalyzed, then at least influenced or primed in some way by the Jordan Peterson phenomenon of starting to collectively, surface postmodernism as an issue, and lay bare these kinds of ideas and get people kind of popularly engaging with these topics and trying to potentially move beyond them. So that's all kind of where we've been and where it's at. And I guess, to be totally frank and lay my cards on the table, I mean, a lot of that I find a little worrisome in the sense of the specific flavor that it takes and the direction that it's going. The form of metamodern Christianity that I've tried to be advocating for, that I did those videos about and everything, and still am working towards, though I'll admit that topic has not necessarily taken a backseat to the other things I'm doing. They're just, in terms of the sequence of things I'm working on, that's a little further down the list. But I actually am deeply engaged with the topic of what you could call a metamodern theology, and I am writing on this, and I'll actually probably be submitting an article for publication on some of this stuff. Anyway, what I'm trying to get at in my formulation of what I think of as a metamodern Christianity does not particularly seem to have that kind of deep cultural resonance with people, right? And so, and to be specific, right? I mean, for me, what's really important about that metamodern Christian move is that it takes very seriously not just traditional, let's say, orthodoxy, but also modern historical criticism, right? And then also kind of postmodern cultural critique. And so for me, kind of by definition, the metamodern move is going to be something that's moved through those. It's kind of grappled with them in a profound way, and then it's come on the other side while carrying forward, the depth of the Christian tradition. It's moved into a different register that's legitimately, genuinely grapple with those major issues and is on the other side of them. And as I said then, and as I'll say now, because I don't see much difference, I just don't see a lot of that being picked up as part of the mainstream version of this kind of, Christian revival. A lot of it seems to be more or less a kind of engagement with traditional forms of Christianity, and even some fundamentalist forms of Christianity kind of gaining a new resurgent level of interest. And, I think that what concerns me about that, as someone who came from that tradition myself, is I'm just aware of the ways in which eventually versions of that really bottom out and then lead to all sorts of crises that people grapple with. It's because the questions don't go away, right? Modern historical criticism doesn't go away, and postmodern contextualization and pluralism doesn't go away. You can try to, kind of just sidestep it, but that doesn't deal with it head on. And I just am very emphatic that the kind of metamodern Christianity I'm really interested in is one that deals with these things head on and then tries to do something different. But I'm also keenly aware that the version of Christianity that emerges on the other side of that might not be attractive for most people. So that's, anyway, just a set of observations of what I see going on in culture and how my view of metamodern Christianity sort of relates to those trends.
Well, do you have a elevator pitch for it?
For metamodern Christianity?
Yeah.
Well, kind of like I said, I think a metamodern Christianity needs to take seriously traditional, modern, and postmodern insights about the Christian tradition. I mean, that's the simple, take.
Yeah,
and you can unpack that.
And I know you also had a conversation with Ben Oss. His and he's kind of in the academic world, yeah, more or less. And I actually just released a conversation with him, and I do. It seems he's somebody, at least in this. I know y'all went kind of round and round on the getting into some kind of, I don't know, hermeneutical weeds or something like that. But there is something to, at least in the conversation I had with him, where it seems closer to what you're talking about. Not to this, not in a transcendent way. It seems this was one of the questions I think I was curious about, because I have a family. I think about trying, what does it mean to pass on your faith? And and one of the ways that I've changed mentally, theologically, related to what that means is that, and it is influenced by kind of this Petersonian thing. So we can kind of see where these, like you're saying, is that a good trajectory? But how do you, for, this is complicated, so I'm having to work through some ideas. So like a traditional simplified version of something like the gospel, of the Christian story of that, related to something like the forgiveness of sin, something like these, how do you, if you do, like, to go back to something like the Apostles' Creed, even something like that kind of distillation of Christianity, if I'm going to hold that and pass it to my children, my desire is, because I do believe this, I want them to have at least like a clear, not like maybe a Yale Divinity School historical critical method clear version of Christianity, but like a clear version of, I guess, traditional Christianity in a sense, like that that it has to be, we were talking about like how something's packaged and how something's clear. And it takes on like, oh, I'm going to participate with Advent, and we're going to have candles, and we're going to have like a weekly family meeting. And we're going to just do something very simple. Mm-hmm. But is that setting them up for failure, like you said? And so is there a way like where you would see that process of like what I'm, because I think the pluralistic is like, oh, I should also do like Hanukkah, and I should also do like Ramadan, or those are the like questions like.
Yeah. Well, so just to be clear on a couple fronts, I wouldn't at all say that, doing Advent and candles and the whole, rich, beautiful Christian seasonal traditions, all of that, I would never say that sets anyone up for failure. I think that's part of what it means to grow up in a rich tradition, right? And I also don't think that adults taking pluralism seriously means that you have to inculcate in your children from the earliest of ages like a religious confusion, but I think that there is a meaningful difference between how adults are holding this content versus what they're passing on to their kids at different developmental stages. Ironically, I actually find that some of the what we might associate with sort of like, traditional Christianity, how do I want to say this? Like theologically, it's actually really hard for kids to appropriately get and understand, right? And it can be traumatic, right? If you just go, hey, there's this thing called hell and there's heaven. And if you don't believe X, Y, and Z, that Jesus died for your sins, you're going to go to hell and you're going to burn for eternity. And by the way, the world's going to end and the trumpets are going to sound. I mean, this is what I grew up with. And there's something actually existentially scarring, like, religiously traumatic if you kind of put that on a kid at the wrong age. And yet I would say that those ideas are kind of more, they're traditional in the sense that they're, kind of more from a mythic literal standpoint around what the tradition is saying around these sorts of things. So I've always kind of been very emphatic. In fact, my kind of one way you could distill what I'm getting at in a lot of my talk about metamodern Christianity is being developmentally sensitive, right? Of like what should and can children, be understanding and engaging with at certain ages, and how do we tailor, pedagogy and enculturation and, just, I don't know, raising kids in the church. Like, what does that look like age appropriately relative to these things? So that's kind of it's an interesting and an important question, but I also see it as being different from what adult, Christian thinkers, how they're understanding their faith. I think that it does become, let's say, maladaptive at a certain point if what the kids are learning in Sunday school around like Noah and the boat and all the animals going on the boat, if like a 30-year-old man believes that also happened in that way, like then I actually see that makes sense developmentally for a 6 or 7-year-old to see like all the animals going on the ark at the same time and there was a flood and then all of that, versus what makes more developmental sense for adults in the 21st century. So that is kind of one of the ways I'd go at it. But just to also again emphasize that, like, no, I think one of the things that's so crucially missing from people's experiences and why so many are turning to traditional forms of religion is because they want tradition, right? So I think tradition's beautiful, and there's no problem with traditions being exclusive, right? Like if my brother-in-law is Jewish and he wants to do Hanukkah with his kids, and do Hanukkah with your kids, right? If you're Christian, then do the Christian thing with your kids. I think that's lovely. Pluralism for adults and what they consider that to mean, though, I think is a broader issue, and it's sort of for people navigating the complexity of the 21st century. How do adults think of their own traditions in a broader landscape of other faith traditions? And there I do think it can become unhelpful and unhealthy for people to over reify their own religious traditions and stories and symbols and mythoi, and then by contrast, basically cut out and shove out all these other traditions as just sort of being wrong or whatever. And you can do that in ways that aren't just sort of, postmodern, radically relativistic and, confusing.
Yeah. I think there's like this thing that's happening both because, there's this, obviously an attack on liberalism, right? Like in the classical form, right? Which is kind of what you're describing in kind of the pluralistic perspective on that. And, I have to kind of just reference like my own, like walking through the, now that I'm 40, kids, like I'm having like to actively do that in a world where it's like when I gave my daughter a Spotify account like a year ago, I was like, here's every song in the world.
Yeah, right.
That's what I told her. I was like, this is so different from my sheltered reality that I grew up in. But like, which is like, here is pluralism. Here's every worldview. Here's every, thing. Here it is.
Yeah.
And,
I was
just going to say the part about tradition, but also kind of the epistemological underpinnings of like, well, in a sense, like that question of, am I giving this to my kids because I think tradition has like an aesthetic, nice cultural thing, or is there also a piece of it that I believe is true?
Mm-hmm.
And so then, but also be like, hey, Gilgamesh and Noah, and there's all the 150 accounts of a great flood, like Atlantis, like there's like Joe Rogan, the driest whatever, like there's the whatever, there's all these things, right? And so those questions of the tradition you offer, like I believe, like you said, how do you get out of that the postmodern pluralism or relativism? And it's like, well, this is pretty quote unquote American in a sense. This is pretty this is, in a sense, this is related to your mom and I's upbringing. In a sense, there's like these other pieces to it. And so I don't know. I'm just trying to engage with that, like where because I can hold in my mind, like I already referenced, the Noah conversation, like just like as you bring it up, because this other piece of like in the meta reality, this was a question I had. It's like, what do we do with those symbols? What do we do with those stories? Because the ark is a theological symbol. It's that word, and like so those that's a question too. Like, what do we do with symbols in that post reality?
Totally. Well, yeah. Real quick, when you mentioned the Spotify, all that stuff, I also wanted to be clear too. Like, I actually think it can be very dangerous for kids to have access to everything,
Thanks,
right? So
Brendan. Thanks.
I'm just saying, well, no,
it is. Yeah.
Like, I just don't want people to think that what I'm suggesting is that, like, oh, you just give kids everything, right? I think it's developmentally inappropriate to have, like no boundaries, right? Like the whole developmentally appropriate thing is that you recognize what fits at different stages and what kids are ready for and this sort of thing. But as for the symbols bit, the way I think about it, and again, this is just my take, but like, that's a great story for kids, right? And you go to church and they go off to children's church, and then you do a thing on that story and you color in or whatever, and you do a thing, right? That story works really well, 6, 7, 8. Okay. And then, you start getting 9, 10, 11, and then kind of new things come online for you. And you can start to engage with your religious tradition in a little bit of a deeper way. And certainly by the time you get into adolescence and your teenage years, then you're really kind of flowered intellectually, and you can really, now take a new relationship to that stuff. And at that point, I would say, then, I think if the conditions aren't overly pressurized and there's not like this obsession that, about inerrancy and literalism and certain kinds of theological, concerns, that people can, kind of move on from overly literalizing the Noah story, right? And then they can start to take in knowledge about, and then there's like all these other stories from the ancient Near East and ... And then at that point, it's like, that's fine. Yeah, cool, right? But they've digested the symbol. They did it at the age appropriate time. It had a significance to them then that's different now, and that's fine, but it's still in their psyche now, right? They can draw on that rich symbolic imagery to do the sorts of things that Jonathan Pageau at his best is able to kind of get at, of like, oh, and then see, this is this, right? And so it kind of has done the work. I think, though, and this is just a kind of simple point I try to make, is that, like, again, if you're 30, but you aren't just relating to Noah as a symbol and as part of this rich tapestry of sort of images and ideas and all that, but as historical, literal fact, that's when it becomes a little bit, it's just going to be cognitive dissonance, right? Because it's sort of like, yeah.
I think in one of our earlier conversations, this was the critique you had on pastors, like learning historical critical theories and of biblical historical fact and these things. What is the relationship between, okay, so we've constructed a faith, now let me deconstruct, like, are we trying to walk people through, like, let me now deconstruct it in a certain way, and then so it can, I don't know how does that look like is it happening in, like, is that how the quote unquote liberal mainline is doing? Is that what they're doing with their historical Jesus? That kind of, like, if there's a framework, like because I've been involved in, like, the structure of an evangelical church per se, and I'm now involved in another church, helping it get cultivated into these things, and like, okay, so at 15, now I need to deconstruct the Noah story for how, like, hey, I know you learned this in Sunday school, like, how does that work?
Well,
like,
just think about any example, right? I don't think it's a matter of, I'll put it this way. It's about how the construction happens. If you do the construction part in a particular way, then you're going to have to deconstruct. And then that's really messy and harmful and it hurts. And that's not great. But if the whole part of moving through the tradition is constructed differently, then it's very organic and natural, right? In the same way that, I mean, like, I don't think anyone had an existential crisis or a faith crisis when they found out Santa Claus is not an actual person going around the globe, right? And that's fine, because it was sort of like developmentally, that story was like fun and great, and it did this thing at Christmas and all that. And like, when my niece learns that Elf on the Shelf in a couple of years wasn't actually moving around everywhere, she's not going to be like shattered and experience ontological shock, right? She's going to be like, it's just going to be natural. Right now, though, if she was raised in which Elf on the Shelf was like, and the elf is the way that we have to believe that the elf does this, and if it doesn't, then everything's terrible and we're all going to go to hell, or the world, it's like, whoa, that's way too pressurized. Like, just, developmentally, this thing's going to unfold very naturally. If you make it this thing of like, you got to believe X, Y, and Z, and if you don't do that, then it's like, when it does fall apart, then you actually have to deconstruct. And so, yeah.
Well, there's this, a lot of how I have framed what, in moving into a more like mainline tradition for my life, is something like, in a sense, you're more of like, what's the word? Imparting your faith in your tradition. And that happens through, like, infant baptism and those, or, it's more like the ceremonial things where you and I were raised, like, it was like this flattened hierarchy of hyper individualism where you're not, I sure hope you'll make a decision to follow Christ and, escape the flames of hell, where, like, that's not even like the idea for, like, when I'm thinking, actually, our identity is actually a Christian family, and you're a Christian because you're a part of this family until you're like, your agency is beyond that to a degree, and you decide for yourself on that. And that comes from more of like that, like I said, the more historical traditional approach to impart, like, if your child's baptized as a child, they're raised in this faith, regardless of, quote unquote, personal decision, and to a certain point. And so there's this different, like, so there's that, but then there's the other part of kind of like, because I'm with you on, like, the psychological terror that I was raised with as well, and whether that's the rapture, or whether that's, hell's flames, heaven's gates, whether, like, all these things, like, and that, and then even within some of these, like, kind of referencing the specifics of something like dispensational post-millennial, premillennial, I don't know, dispensational premillennialism, is being like, well, that's not even in the framework. So that's a part of where, and it's an even older part of the tradition that, so the going back into bringing forward or something like that. That like my wife, who was raised Lutheran, didn't even none of that was even on the table for her. So even if she did have other reasons why she had existential questions about her Christian faith, it wasn't based upon like psychological terror.
Yeah.
So I think that is a specific way in which the unhealth of those things, unhelpful ways of bringing up within the Christian tradition.
Yeah.
Something like that.
I think you just raised something really, really important and really interesting, which is, as you said, there's a difference between sort of the more traditional forms of raising kids into the faith that included ritual, that included baptism. There was a whole, if you want to use, I don't know, medieval Europe as an example, right? There's the birth, there's the christening, there's the infant baptism, and then, of course, there's all the various holy days, and then there's, some kind of confirmation, presumably, and then there's, all that. And then all of that, just you swim in the ritual. And a lot of that takes the pressure off then it being a hyper individualized, we are this because we believe X, Y, and Z sort of thing. Yeah. Now, in a kind of, modern or postmodern, Protestant evangelicalism, where all those kind of religious trappings are gone and it's all about, the Bible and what we believe, then the identity function is all hanging on what do we believe, right? And that puts a lot of
does this book, have what do I do if there's a crack in here that I don't know how to solve?
Right.
I would think so.
Right. Yeah. You're hanging your entire existential health on a kind of theology that you're even too young to fully understand. And so what that does, I think, is it builds in certain kinds of, profoundly unstable structures that require a lot of energy to try to keep together. Yes. And it's not just the psychological terror bit. I mean, it's interesting to think about what it means for a child to be brought into a family where we are a Christian family. And it's like, well, what does that mean? It's like, well, it means that we believe X, Y, and Z. But by the way, you're not an agent yet, so you aren't really part of that. But when you are a certain point, you really do have to believe that, or otherwise. And then it's like, oh my God. So it's not just psychological terror in the sense of, heavens and hells and antichrists and all that. It's also like social kind of, it's socially impactful in the way of like, oh wow, I'm going to be rejected by my family unless I believe these things. And just puts a lot on kids in a way that I feel like we could do a better, more healthy way of sort of, yeah.
Well, yeah. And those are related to kind of just different traditions. And, that in a sense, the going back and retrieving some of that, like you're saying, like this kind of medieval framework, which is kind of the popular, frame for the what is it? We call it chronically online, or what's the word that terminally online, like I've been enamored by this medieval picture of a cathedral in, Eastern Europe. And I've been, I'm like, okay, so this is who I am. And there's, that happens. And maybe that person gets into like a religious life, but I think there's also knowing the, cause you were raised in a, kind of an evangelical framework, midweek service and, events and camp and all, in regardless of even like what we talked, the critiques on those things, but like getting into a framework. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, I don't know if this is where you were wanting to talk about with metamodern Christianity.
Yeah, this is it.
But that is also the question in, so because do the ideas, or like I was saying, something like, okay, bare bones creed, the Apostles' Creed, like it's kind of a distillation of like, I could be wrong on, but something like this was a, initially like, hey, you believe this? Do you believe this? Okay. We're like, we can engage, so it's like, and again, to getting beyond then just the traditional, but something a little bit more ontological about is this real, and what does it mean if it's real? And is there a different question between what historiography is real and versus what is, I believe it's real because, it's worked with my family, or I'm as a person have had something that I believe is real connected to this story. And again, that goes back into, I think, something that Peterson did. And a lot of young men, it seems like, that are angry at him right now, is because they're like, no, it's not a story. It's all real. And then like you said, there's like, burgeoning into the kind of this fundamentalism. And, but there is something, and if you've come from that, that's the difference between all these kids that were actually raised with atheist parents or nominal parents or something. They're like, oh no, now the counter is to this, yeah. So, and at some point, are they going to stumble across what's his name that was real impactful for you, 15 years ago?
Josh McDowell?
No, Bart Ehrman.
Bart Ehrman.
Are they going to come across something like that and like you said, like deal with some kind of existential crisis in 10 years or something? I don't know if that's what you're considering related to that, but
yeah, it is. I mean, because again,
let me tie in just one piece, which is just that. So for my frame of dealing with, well, what is real? Like, this story is real. I don't have the time nor the energy or like that I want to do the historiography on and line up the facts and no, this was 50,000, not 10,000. This was 100,000, not but I believe there's an archetypal reality. And as a result, I do believe it's true. And it's not true in the sense that, or I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's true in the sense that this lines up with every soil sample X, Y, and Z and the fossil record. I don't know. I believe there's like a real archetypal truth here. And you could say that's universal in a certain way. It's like here and in this framework and in this tradition and it was given to me. And so that's the piece I wanted to add on it.
Yeah, I mean, so the question, the reality question is like, it's hard to navigate sometimes because we can mean so many different things by that. I've had, a difficult time a little bit talking with Paul Vanderklay about this. Obviously, Jordan Peterson has fielded versions of these questions that have gone various directions.
Do you believe?
I mean, I would say that, so yeah, you brought up a lot of things. I'm going to try to hit them as I recall, but on the real front, right? Like, yeah, on the archetypal level, 100%, right? And so it depends what we mean by real. And if we have a kind of one notion of what real means, then and this isn't splitting hairs. It's actually like
No, that was a lightsaber. That was like, what do you mean by real?
Yeah. Well, like so I don't know if I ever use this example in a conversation we've had, but it can be helpful to kind of get at this. There's a metamodern philosopher named Jason Storm who talks about realism and how we're often talking past each other because what do we mean by real, right? So if a person says that's not the real Madonna, what do they mean? What can that mean? It can mean so many different things, that it's not the real Madonna singer, that it's not the real picture of the Virgin Mary Madonna, or that it's not the real Virgin Mary, like even just the difference between the representation and the real, or that the symbol of the Virgin Mary today is not the real Virgin Mary of the historical Virgin Mary, or that so the word, it's not the real this or that. What he makes the point is that you have to be very specific just in terms of what you are contrasting something against, right? If I say this isn't a real glass, well, what am I comparing the realness there to? That it's not glass, that it's not a cup, that, all these things. Now, again, this might sound like philosophical hair splitting, but if you can just appreciate that actually a lot of these really important theological questions hinge on some of this, just being careful with the language, right? So if we can appreciate the meta realism that Jason Storm's talking about, that like there are different ways for things to be real, then it's very comfortable for someone to say like, yes, the Christian story is real. And from the perspective of when we mean that we're talking archetypally, or no, the Christian story is not real if we're talking blah, blah, blah. And even within that, we should be very specific, right? Because even if the frame is historical realism, then like there might be parts of the Christian story that accord to that kind of realism and parts that don't. So we shouldn't just be blanket and say, oh, it's all real or it's not real. So I just think that kind of carefulness is important for some of these things. And when we can be more specific, we can be clear with each other, and then, not talk past each other. And then we can actually get a sense for the reality of the tradition. So for my own part, I'll just say that like, I'm emphatic to embrace the reality of the Christian story at a profound archetypal, symbolic, what would you say, kind of psychological, and a bunch of these kinds of different registers, profoundly real. Right now, that's a different kind of real. If we're going to then say, bring in, what we mean by modern history, and as you kind of put it in your terms, like what exactly is in the soil samples and the different archaeological strata or whatever, different kind of real. Now, from where I would sit as a metamodern Christian, I would say that's the kind of real that really matters. If we want to, say that it's also this archaeologically real thing, and put so much of our faith on that, that's when I feel like we wind up limiting what the Christian story is actually really about, right? And I think this is another place where some of the evangelical Protestant tradition has overemphasized a certain kind of propositional historical kind of reality, right? Because if you grow up in that medieval world and you swim in that Christian cosmos, and these archetypes are real, and you go through the rituals and all this stuff, and it's about how you are in the world and how you relate to other people and how you see the meaning and significance of reality, that's a different kind of way to be a Christian than it's about believing X, Y, and Z. And if you don't believe this, then you're not, and blah, 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 blah. So like,
like the faith hinging on those things, but also it's strange though, because there's also like, even within the kind of evangelical modern frame, like the personal relationship, or but even into like the postmodern, like the personal lived experience though piece that still also comes into play related to people having, mystical experiences and those types of things. And so it's like, on those different levels of, it's real to me because this experience X, Y, and Z more than this other part. But you kind of said two things there with I kind of was, with the soil samples and things, you were like, that really matters. But then there's the version of Christian, kind of, let's say, archetypal, symbolic, ritualistic version of Christianity really matters. And is the point in between, like, what is that piece? Is there a point in between there that?
Yeah, I mean, what I would be saying is that the historical stuff matters in the sense that if you're wrong about it, you might it's going to be unhelpful in all sorts of ways. And maybe it's actually going to be a negative experience if you put all your eggs in a certain basket and then that one doesn't pan out. Right now, I don't think that that's the limit of Christianity. I don't think Christianity boils down to a set of, propositions that you affirm or don't. And if those don't turn out to be historically accurate as portrayed in ... then it all, it's a house of cards. I think if it's that, then it's very brittle and it's very weak. And I experienced that collapse. And so I think that if you put all your eggs in that basket, you're very liable to have your house of cards collapse. I think Christianity is much, much richer. And it includes all the archetypal stuff that we were talking about, but it also includes the mystical things you were just talking about. Like, people can have a relationship with Jesus, and that's a real experience. Now, I would say that's totally legit. And if you want to live into that aspect of your Christian faith, that can be deeply, deeply meaningful, essential, crucial to your whole way of moving through the world. And I would even say that's real. But why your relationship with Jesus as you move through life is all potentially hanging on what happened in 30 AD Palestine is it's like, well, wait a second, is this actually happening or not? Like, if I learned that they found the bones of Jesus, does that mean, wait, who's this person I've been talking to, right? It's like that, it confuses all these things. So I just, I think that it's important, but it's important in a way of how we don't overly pressurize it. I think it's, if you're saying that it's important because it's so matters, that's when it's important that we don't do that move. And to pick up your question from before, yeah, I really do think that people who, coming out of an atheist background or what have you, who find fundamentalist Christianity, they're setting themselves up for another, or let's just say a existential shock potentially, because all that stuff's still out there. Bart Ehrman's still out there. Historical criticism's still out there. It's not going anywhere, right? It's been around for hundreds of years now. So
this was another place I wanted to take the conversation, because there's a let's see here. Have you heard of The Critical Journey before?
No.
By let's see, by Janet Hagberg and Robert Gulick. It's a book. It outlines kind of 6 phases of a spiritual life, which is the recognition of God, the life of discipleship, the productive life, like then you're like maybe a leader or something. But then they go into kind of this, so there's like a wall there after 3. And if you don't go through the wall, then you're bound to like repeat this cycle. The going through the wall is then a journey inward to deal with like, wounds, or like maybe it's sometimes it's also put together with like as a crisis after you have like, and then the journey outward is like, building meaning into that. And we can kind of go into kind of the meaning crisis conversation too, but I think it goes together with what we're talking about. Like the concern that you have related to going into this, and then you're just going to hit that wall again, possibly. And are you going to be able to get through that wall to rebuilding a life with some kind of integration of those 2 things? And then the stage 6 being like the life of love, which is kind of like, in stage legacy and whatever. I don't know. How does that, I know it's a really crass framework that I'm not probably doing a justice.
No, I mean, it resonates. And I mean, anyone who knows my works knows I love a good stage theory. I think it works pretty well. I mean, there's something there, right? I mean, you could break down a number of these different kinds of models into similar kinds of even more crude kind of major areas, right? And I mean, it's something like you have the early kind of naivete, and then that grows into maybe something of a kind of more personal commitment that is sort of like, I assent to this. This is like my thing. And if this process continues, then that moves into something like, this is more complicated than I thought. Then there's some skepticism, some critical thinking, some needing evidence, all that kind of more critical thing starts to set in. And that can go different directions. But then there's another thing on the other side of that, which is that the deep wisdom and truth and sort of felt resonance of the whole thing returns, but in a different register. You're able to let go overly intellectualizing everything and overly, reflecting on it all. You're able to appreciate the symbols for what they are. You're able to embrace the mystery and the paradox. And then that kind of even can deepen into something that's even kind of more mystical. And that's actually Fowler's faith stages, basically, if people are familiar with that very influential model, but also something like Brian McLaren's model, right? Of simplicity to complexity to perplexity to harmony. I think that's beautiful. Like, and so I think there's something there, which is like, you gotta have to, first you're kind of just awash in it and you take it all as it comes. You're like, oh, okay, this is it. And then you sort of like assent to it. You kind of embrace it. You've learned the ropes and you're like, I'm playing this game. And then you start to realize all the aspects around the game you never saw before and raising all these questions. But then, you get to something beyond that where things coalesce again. And there's a new second order, Paul Ricoeur talked about second naivete and these kinds of things. And I think that's a very lovely kind of arc. And it doesn't need to be a collapse, right? It doesn't need to be deconstruction in some intense way. I think that the intensity of deconstruction only comes about if you've overly constructed in a hyper pressurized way this thing that then you apply the skepticism to, right?
But hasn't that been what's been happening though? Whether that's kind of even, so I'll use 3. I'll use religious fundamentalism, like wokeism, and then this kind of counter to that, like, response to that, whatever label we want to put on that. But it's like these hyper digital, fast, mimetic, because even like kind of like the way we describe like that kind of dispensational upbringing is like this kind of packed, it's like intense and the energy and like the existential. And then there's like the kind of the postmodern version of the woke thing, which was still real similar. And these people, you go through those cycles and a lot of times you do hit a wall with them. And then you either are bound to repeat that because there's like, to use like psychological language, for one, we don't want to actually face the thing that's really causing that drive within us, or and so there's the term like spiritual bypass,
Sure.
you're probably familiar with, and then you kind of repeat that pattern. The person that kind of turned me on to this stage was a popular evangelical voice right now. His name is John Mark Comer. I don't know if you've heard of him in the landscape or not.
No.
He really, do you remember Richard Foster and Dallas Willard? Like,
Dallas Willard sounds familiar.
Yeah, they were real, they were kind of these modern the last 50, 100 years, like getting like evangelical or Baptist versions of kind of mystical. And so with a lot, they dealt a lot with practices, and Willard's book was Celebration of the Disciplines, I think was his name. Like, so fasting and prayer and, confession and these things like within that context. So he's kind of the successor to that. So he's, looking at these kind of patterns that we're talking about related to this. And he's the one that kind of gave like these frameworks, and or some careerism could also be like stage 1, 2, and 3 in a sense. And we just like related to meaning and purpose and life, keep hitting against that wall. Okay, now I've had success here, but then like, why do I still feel empty? Why do I still feel? And even within, now I'm a leader in the church. And then like, whether it's doubt or whether it's just like, I don't know, but like that, I wonder, like with part of the meaning crisis, like collectively, we have been hitting for a long time. We've been hitting that wall because everything has been so compressed, like you were saying. And we need to actually slow down, like, and spread out that life. An example I use related to, how similar to how you and I were raised is like, it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. We can't like, I don't know if you ever heard like that kind of like related to Easter. It's Friday, but Sunday's coming. We can't sit with the suffering. We can't, Good Friday, that's for the Catholics or, whatever. And like, I was talking to my wife about this last night, like in reference to being in the Advent season, but like thinking about Mary, like the journey, the time, like of this season, like the contemplation of what this great mystery might mean related to the incarnation. It's like, and we can have all sorts of other historical critical conversations about that whole thing, but regardless, considering like being able to take these seasons of in a sense contemplation that were built into a slower life, and so trying to find. And so these things, like taking them from history in a sense, but they're not going to look the same when a guy like modern people, postmodern, metamodern people take these things and re-inhabit them. But I don't know. That's kind of what the thing about that, hitting those stages, those walls or whatever.
Well, so a couple thoughts. One is I've definitely known folks who basically, in terms of the repetition that you're talking about, they were raised in the church, they were evangelical, they were the most moralistic, blah, 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 radically deconstructed, and then found wokeism and started doing the exact same thing and just telling everyone how to, right? And it's because it's a structure. It's like the content can change, but the structure of consciousness is the same. And it's very dogmatic and moralistic and this other kind of thing. So, and then it's sort of like you actually, you can start using woo-y kind of new age language here, but there's something to it. Like you need to break through that level of consciousness before you're able to kind of get past that cycle. And so that is a turning inward and being reflective and all that. So I think there's definitely a lot to that. I really like what you're saying though around the slowing down, the depressurizing, embracing, the rich traditions of Advent and contemplation, and the whole thing. Because I guess if you wanted to go back to the elevator pitch of what I'm talking about, I just like we just gotta chill. We just gotta slow down. We gotta just like in the evangelical tradition that we're talking about, right? It's like psychological terror. No, man, just like right, like come on, like Christianity, shouldn't, I think, if it's going to be full and rich and beautiful and lead to human flourishing and all of that, it shouldn't be this like intense, we need to get this and you've got to, you're going to come up to the age of consent and agency real soon. So make sure you've done, and this highly intense thing, right? It's sort of like, let's have actually a little bit more faith in the whole thing, right? It's like, otherwise there is this tendency to be like, oh, we've got to make sure that we do this, or that, you know, Joey believes this, or that whatever. And it's like, oh my gosh, like, just have faith, just trust, you know, if God's in control, just like, that's a great, you know, way to just live into the truth of Christianity. And then allow yourself the slowness of contemplation, and allow people to kind of move through their own version of the journey as they're experiencing it. You know, I don't know. I mean, I don't know your experiences with these kinds of things, but it often seems to be that what we get most pressurized to adopt as kids is what we're most likely to rebel against later on. And so one of the best ways you can actually inculcate in your kids and pass along the Christian tradition is to not be like so intense about it, and just, you do the ritual and you do this. And then when questions come up, you try to answer them, but, you know, always be like, but, you know, you keep looking and, you know, all this stuff. Because I do think if you really just take the heart of Christianity, as I see it anyway, of what like is really meaningful there, I think God would want people coming to him because they are not pressured into it or coerced or shamed into it, but that they've had the natural, full, rich, open embrace of a loving context in which they can grow into a deepening relationship with God. And as soon as you kind of try to preempt that, or, you know, overly, you know, create it, coerce it, it becomes this other thing. I just watched Groundhog Day the other day, and, you know, there's that scene where he's just had this beautiful day with his producer Rita, and they're like, he's trying to fall in love with her, or trying to get her to fall in love with him, and all this, and just all this beautiful organic, it was so magical. But then he wakes up the next day and he's got to do it all again, but then he has to like try to make it happen, and then it's all like the whole vibe is off, and it's just like, oh, this is not right. And so I think that faith should be more like the former, right? And that, we can create that room there for people to flower and grow and naturally develop into a Christian life, and that's probably overall better for everyone.
Yeah, the you know, just like you said, coming from that the intensities of anxiety, actually there's a late 18th century, maybe 19th century Reformed theologian, a guy named William Nevin, and he wrote a book. Well, he wrote two books, but one was called the mystical presence about the Eucharist or whatever. The other one was called The Anxious Bench, and he was writing a critique about kind of modern evangelical, or what I mean, it wouldn't be considered modern, but like the pressure, like the pressure of that kind of decision. He saw kind of the emotional or the emotive thrust that was coming in through the culture in those frameworks. He was already critiquing it, saying, you know, this is not going to be good. You know, it's actually going to be very bad. And so I do feel like there's like a collective wound related to that has come from, you know, high pressure, in a sense, sales, you know, for the evangelists and the faith, you know, faith healers and all those kinds of things. But the other piece, though, where I'm seeing it, the part where, and I'd be interested to connect this to kind of that pattern we were talking about earlier about like, well, how do you take these ideas and get them into the culture? And the way that that's modeled for us in this marketplace of ideas is through kind of corporate structure, right? And I've seen like the last 10 years of my life, things related to the church growth movements in modern evangelicalism is, in a sense, it can be just as damaging as the existential things, because it's it is well,
grow or die.
Basically, it's like like startup culture, and like we got, you know, all this pressure, we got to get people here, and like all the impetus thing comes into like, well, what are we making? Like, you know, like you know, just some kind of like a symbol. What's this when people assembly? Hold on just a second. So the piece I was talking about, this kind of corporate growth culture, getting ideas into the marketplace, like it kind of takes the soul out of what we or you or like. So that might be an interesting thing. It's like, you know, we talked about your journey and this kind of like what brought you into this stage of like wanting to like help people or through crises of meaning, cultural metamodern. It's got to be something more. And this point of corporatism and, you know, capitalism and whatever, you know, critiques one could make on those things. But in the religious spaces, it's something that I continue to come into contact with related to some of these pitfalls. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah. No, I think it's great what you're surfacing there. I would agree. And I mean, I think a lot of, again, the motivation, the intent, the impetus for people seeking for the depths of tradition and the beauty of ritual and all that is as a response to a reaction against the over commodification and consumerization and, kind of, the corporatization of everything. Now, I mean, it used to be like there were salespeople, but now there are influencers, and so all your friends can be trying to sell you nonsense all the time, and everything just becomes fake and hollow, and it can be really awful. And so I think it's like, give us some depth, give us some reality, some substance, and I think that not accidentally, religion is where you found that in a deep, rich, ancient, pre-modern thing where the people weren't always just going, trying to make more, maximize, expand, grow, all this. And I think that's worth really living into. And I think some of the, the voices in the space that I'm aware of, and not deeply aware of, but more through osmosis, people like Paul Kingsnorth and others that are kind of, I think, getting at this kind of a critique through the religious lens of our contemporary society. I really resonate with that. And I think that there's a deep message there. And I think it is about, decreasing the anxiety and the intensity and the pressure around the theological emphasis, right? And there's a deep wisdom, I think, in doing that, not only to reduce the psychological terror or the social, kind of pressure and shame campaigns and all that, but also because I think if you look at the rise of Christianity, my belief would be, it was because it was a countercultural thing of people being loving and kind and trying to help their neighbor in a world of really nasty, terrible, games, bread and circuses and everything, right? And if you can be a light in the world, then that will be a natural draw to Christianity. And so it's not a matter of trying to make sure people believe the right thing. It's around how do you show up in the world in a loving, caring, thoughtful way that's not about, like the dogmatism. And so ironically, I think the emphasis on the dogmatism aspect of it, or at least the right belief, the orthodoxy part of it in that sense, is a real origin of repulsion for a lot of people. And ironically, the forms of Christianity that tend to attract more people is just because, I mean, it's like, right, it's like when you're trying to, I don't know, get a girl's attention, or you're trying to kind of be flirtatious in a way, you don't want to come on super strong. It's going to destroy the whole thing. It's the whole kind of game that, it's like, and here's the other thing too. It shouldn't just be a game, right? It can't just be, oh, this is a strategy because this will work better than the way we've done it. It actually has to be like, no, that's not the point. And I do think that then within individual Christian minds, there has to be a de-emphasis on saving souls. And maybe this is a challenge enduring from the, really what evangelicalism is about and what motivates it at its core. Because if it is about going out there and evangelizing, I don't know, that's a different focus than trying to live a flourishing and loving human Christian life, wherever. And I so there's some deep tensions there, at least, but I think it's a really, really interesting insight.
If we can get everybody to make the greatest existential decision they could ever make on their front porch.
Yeah, right.
And then everything will be okay. I think this relates, kind of one of the, as we were kind of winding our time down here. Yeah. I didn't talk to you. You put out a video a while back about transjectivity. And of course you already mentioned earlier in the conversation, like you're working with John Vervaeke, and you've done a few podcasts with him. And is the relationship, transjectivity in our relationship to meaning, and how, again, coming, if we bring back, stay in the Christian lane, because, yours truly. So, hey, is the relationship to the, theologically, sacraments. And I think that for me, I've come into a framework that kind of puts a lot of emphasis, in a sense, like in my tradition, being, I don't know, having a strong belief, whatever, dogmatist, am I going to dogmatist, but like sacramental ontology, being a part of the nature of what I think has to ground these tradition, because for one, AI and the metaverse, like these things, and like what it means to be human and all this stuff. These existential questions are coming more to the fray, and something about having a meaningful relationship to, in this, time of year, we would say like the incarnation of Jesus Christ through something like sacraments is, I think, and how would I think the reason, like if you want to say the scientific or philosophical reasoning being, because there is something real about transjectivity and our relationship to objects, our relationship to things. And I was wondering if maybe there was a way you could play with me on that idea.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, maybe. Well, it'd be nice to have a little more time to unpack that.
Yeah,
further. I know we don't really have it. No, but I mean, just to kind of riff on some of those things, I guess I'd say so. Taking the reality of transjective relationships seriously, I guess, and using that as a lens through which you relate to the sacraments. I would say there's a lot of different ways that things can be considered in a transjective relationship. It's just sort of like, what's the between space between me and the rest of this. It's not in the thing itself, and it's not just in me. It's somehow something that's kind of being co-enacted here. I think there's something really interesting about thinking about sort of the sacraments, and let's say what one might mean by either transubstantiation or consubstantiation, or the different interpretations of that, and that kind of move. And these are the sorts of moves that I think like a metamodern theology would be trying to make, right? Which is that, yeah, maybe the pre-modern view was that the priest says the thing, and now the essence has been altered, and so it's the thing. It's actually like objective, right? And then the modern,
rejection of that,
yeah, and they basically say no. It's just a subjective kind of relationship to this thing symbolically, right? And I think you can actually then do that next kind of metamodern transjective thing, where it's like, well, maybe it's not really either, but through ritual enactment, the world changes. And actually, I'm writing an introduction to a book right now where this is kind of my whole point. It's like, this is really key. And so, yes, I would say that there's a lot to that. And so it's not, I think we depreciate it too much if we just say, oh, but it's just a symbol, right? And it's just something we do, right? But it means something different. I mean, I'll put it this way, right? It means something different when a person is standing in front of you in a robe and like holding out this, chalice and like looking around very seriously. Like, that's a real thing that's happening, and that's changing the whole energy of the space, right? Versus just like, and now we'll do this and blah, 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 right? So like real differences. And so the context changes things. There's also a great book called Context Changes Everything by complexity scientist Alicia Herrera, which you could bring into some of this. So anyway, long and short of it, yes, this is the kind of inactive ritual framing that I think is very metamodern in nature. And I think that people could write probably dissertations on looking at like the sacraments through this lens, and it would be really productive.
Yeah. And I happen to, I mean, in a more pluralistic frame, I think that there's something teleological about that in, say, a worship service or, in a liturgy that can help create, like, getting at it from this, in a sense, from this perspective that can help create some different relationality. And now you're not ever going to, I say ever, but getting around theological distinctives, but kind of a recognition that you're saying, like, this is doing the way that you approach this and your relationship to these pieces of matter, and how, and your belief about that also, but also how it's presented and how it's attended to and cared for.
Totally.
Like those aren't quote unquote theological words. Those are like more in line and with, I guess, what I think I understand to be transjectivity. And like, to me, that's what reinforces the need for like a sacramental ontology in this, moving, for me in my journey moving forward, thinking that that's really important, because coming from the kind of rock band, like, you're the icon, you're the one in the middle of the stage, like, and you're the one offering the mediation. But there's something different whenever we're saying, like, it's actually beyond the priest or the pastor. It's like, here, this is Christ. And so, and there's different traditions, like you said, you mentioned kind of two of those theological frameworks, but it's like, at the end of the day, I think that they are, philosophically, in a sense, doing something similar that's important, that oh, that's rote dead religion, and now we're on, a different reason why people are wanting to go to these traditions. But for me, as being someone that did a lot of quote unquote liturgy, kind of the modern worship liturgy, is reevaluating that and being a part of that framework, that has been a helpful tool to consider of like why I think it's important to participate in that way.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, I know you've got to run, but just real quick on that. I mean, I think this is really, really great and really important. I wish we had a little bit more time to talk about this, because I think it's really at the heart of a different way of relating to God, ritual, sacraments, etc. And I mean, I'll just use this example. When I was, I think, 11, I was slain in the spirit at one of my, charismatic churches. Now I'm 10, but I'm in this room and I feel, the intensity here. And it was an objective fact for me that I, that happened to me and I fell over. And it wasn't like, oh, I chose to do this. It wasn't subjective. It was like, this happened. Now, one of them, like the more traditional way of interpreting that was that the spirit kind of came down or was present or something, right? I think there's a different way that I think maintains the same fullness and the seriousness of what's going on there, but gives it a different spin, which is actually that the spirit was generated, right? That people in that context through, and I mean, sociologists like Emil Durkheim talk about collective effervescence, this kind of thing, that the spirit was emergent. You get enough people together, right? Where three or was it two or more in my name are gathered, that sort of thing, right? You get a field effect. And when that's really going, the spirit is present. And then that's going to have an objective function that's going to knock people over, right? That's not just subjective. But what's interesting is that it's produced, it's co-produced, and it's co-generated. And so I find that a very much more powerful and really interesting model for thinking about how we relate to the divine as participatory. And it allows us to see what's going on in those contexts, I think, with a little different angle. And the to the point of ritual and liturgy, right? If you come into liturgy with a teleological orientation that you're trying to generate the spirit for people, right? There's a whole embodied sacramental stance and style and thing that you do to help the spirit emerge, and that can have a trajectory, and it can have a kind of peak occurrence at a particular moment. All that, there's a way in which then we're sort of divine participants. We are actually being in service to, like we are divine functionaries really in the spirit manifesting. And I think that's a very beautiful way of thinking about liturgy.
Man, yeah, I opened a can of worms, dude.
Yeah, we'll have to pick that one up some other time.
We do need to wrap up, but that was, that's true. And the word that kept coming to my mind, which would take us to a whole nother, like, is there a differentiation between that and the word conjure? And so that kind of was what, maybe we can pick that up in a later conversation. But I appreciate you coming and sharing conversation. This went by very fast for me. I felt like we were in a nice dialogical space together, Brendan. And so everyone check out Brendan at Sky Meadow Institute and their work that's coming out. Check his YouTube out, and thanks for being here with me today, man.
I just want to say before we go, thank you, my friend. I really appreciate it. This was a great conversation. And, I would say very meaningfully to you that I see you as someone operating from that kind of Christian sensibility in which, like, you're a deeply caring and loving person in a way that's sort of like, hey, let's talk to Brendan again, regardless of the fact that he's might have all sorts of heterodox views about this or that. You show up in a very interpersonally caring way that feels very authentic. And I appreciate that about you. And I feel like that's, for me, very authentic Christianity in action. So thank you for that. And thanks for this opportunity. This was a great conversation.
All right, man. Until we meet again.
Yeah.
Thanks for making it to the end of the podcast today with Brendan Graham Dempsey. If you enjoyed that conversation, check out these other featured conversations here in this little corner of the internet, or check out my previous conversations I've had with Brendan here. Or if you want to follow along on the podcast, follow this link. Don't forget, like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Have a good day.